reviewing the July 2017 Watchtower Study Edition for the week of September 11th through 17th. This is the JW Review. So this week we are going to look at the article Praise Jah Why in the July 2017 Watchtower Study Edition, and this is for the week of September 11th through 17th. So we're going to click here, and of course if you're listening to this via podcast, you're not going to see any of this, but you can listen to it. Hopefully you can still benefit. So most of this article we're not going to really go through. There were only a couple of small key points I wanted to address. And so we're going to skip down all the way to paragraph 12. So this might be a pretty quick podcast. So let's read paragraph 12. On the other hand, God hurls the wicked to the ground. These are strong words. To benefit from Jehovah's loyal love and to avoid his wrath, we have to hate what he hates. For instance, we are to hate sexual immorality. This means that we have to stay away from anything that could lead us into such wrongdoing, including pornography. This may be a hard fight, but having Jehovah's blessing is worth any effort we must put forth. So most of this I actually agree with, and most of you probably agree with it too for the most part, but it's really the subtleties that make a difference here. So if you notice the subtlety, it's that benefiting from Jehovah's loyal love and avoiding his wrath. So if I were to ask you, just at a random point during the day, how do you avoid the wrath of God? How do you benefit from God's love? How would you answer that? Well, if we're going to stick to this paragraph, it's basically hate sin, love God, stay away from sin. So I think that's a problem to really put it that way and to not really qualify. I know what the Watchtower is trying to say, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt here, but I would never put it that way. I would never say that to avoid the wrath of God, you have to hate what God hates. Yes, you should hate what God hates. Yes, you should hate sexual immorality, and you should avoid all of that. But that's not the basis for which you avoid the wrath of God, because none of you, myself included, can do that perfectly or even close. We all struggle with these things. So to answer the question of how do we avoid the wrath of God, we have to go to the scriptures, because if we look at Psalm 97:10, we're not going to see an answer to this question, how do you avoid the wrath of God? So let's look at Psalm 97:10. It says, hate evil, you who love Jehovah, who preserves the souls of his godly ones. He delivers them from the hand of the wicked. So if we're talking about avoiding the wrath of God in the sense of you're not going to experience his wrath as an unbeliever would, this isn't really saying that. This is not saying that. So let's go to a text where I think does address avoiding the wrath of God, and that would be Romans 5:9. There's many other verses you could go to, but I think this one's really clear. Much more than having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. So avoiding the wrath of God, to do that, you've got to be justified by his blood. So how do you get justified by his blood? Romans 5:10, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So it's really through Jesus Christ, in believing in him, that is how you get this justification, which is being declared righteous. It's through Christ and through Christ alone. So I just don't see how the Watchtower can actually say this without very carefully qualifying what it is they mean. And in fact, in verse 13, they go on to try to qualify, but they're talking about not relying on your own strength, but relying on God and begging Him for help, which I agree with. But still, why don't we see here something about putting your faith and trust in Jesus Christ for salvation, and that's how you avoid the wrath of God? Because I'm sure the Watchtower says that in other places, but why aren't they saying it here when it's needed the most? Okay, we're going to skip down here, and this is a comment that's said in passing, but I am just baffled by it. It says, "Today we are blessed," and this is paragraph 18. It says, "Today we are blessed to be the only ones on earth called by God's name." So I'm not going to dispute. I'm sure I could find another religion that has the name Jehovah in it, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the Jehovah's Witnesses are the only ones who are blessed to be called by that name, Jehovah. So I wouldn't really be picking on them in this case if they weren't really boasting in this, because you do see a lot of pride on the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses are called by the name of Jehovah. That's the name of God that's used over 6,000 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. So they constantly talk about that. And they also talk a lot about how they're restoring the name of God in the New Testament, which is completely and totally unfounded, because there is not one single solitary Christian Greek manuscript that contains the Tetragrammaton. It's just simply not there, and the Jehovah's Witnesses have wrongly inserted the divine name into the Christian Scriptures. It should not be there because there's no manuscript support for it. So really, there's not really a basis for a Christian to call themselves a Jehovah's Witness. So if this was the only thing I disagreed with the Jehovah's Witness on, I really wouldn't be picking on them about this. It's just not that kind of issue that I would really die on a hill. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are essentially bragging about this, that they're the only ones being called by God's name. And if you're really unfamiliar with the reasoning for this, they base it off of Isaiah 43:10. So let's read that. Isaiah 43:10, "You are my witnesses, declares Jehovah, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know me and believe in me and understand that I am He. Before me there was no God formed, and there will be none after me." So this first part of the verse where Jehovah says, "You are my witnesses," where he's talking, of course, to Jews, but that's really where the Jehovah's Witnesses get their name. But is that really a good reason for a Christian after the coming of Christ to refer to themselves as? Well, I don't see any basis for that. In fact, I don't even really see any basis for saying that the Jews were calling themselves that. So it's fine in a sense if a Christian just wants to call themselves a witness of Jehovah. That's fine. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm not going to die on that hill. But the Jehovah's Witnesses seem to think that that's the best thing to call themselves. And I don't think that it is. I really don't. I think the best thing that a Christian can refer to themselves as is either a Christian or a follower of Jesus Christ. And I think the latter is actually a much more strong name to refer to yourself as, especially in a society today, because the word Christian has gotten thrown around by just nominal people who call themselves a Christian. But, however, just because it's been thrown around and wrongly used, I think it's perfectly fine and very justified to call yourselves a Christian, and I think you should prefer that. So Jehovah's Witnesses do refer to themselves as Christians, but not as prominently. So let's actually just go through, because some of you may not even know why followers of Christ refer to themselves as Christians, and there's actually a really solid biblical basis for doing so. So the first one is Mark 9:41. So Mark 9:41, For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because of your name as followers of Christ, truly I say to you, he will not lose his reward. And so what you're going to see through these verses is a theme as to what others referred to the early Christians as. They did not refer to them even as followers of God or of the Lord per se. You might be able to find some cases of that, but I think followers of Christ or Christians is most likely what they were referred to as. Next one is Acts 11:26. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. For an entire year they met with the church and taught considerable numbers. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. So that's what they were first called in Antioch, is Christians, not Jehovah's Witnesses. Next one is Acts 26:28. Agrippa replied to Paul, "In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian." So that's where Paul is talking to the king and just trying to persuade him as to his defenses. So Agrippa replied to Paul saying that you're trying to convince me to become a Christian. So why would he say that if it wasn't for the fact that they were actually called Christians? That name was very well known apparently. Next one is 1 Peter 4:14. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. So Christians held that name. And let's go to verse 15 and 16. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. So you can see so strongly here the name Christian. That is what people were referred to as in the first century. So I have to ask again, why not make that more prominent? Rather than calling yourselves Jehovah's Witnesses, why not witnesses of Christ? Which brings me to my next point. Acts 4:12. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. So that's saying more strongly than the name of Jehovah. That's not even the name of Jehovah that's the most prominent name by which we must be saved. It's the name of Christ, because there is salvation in no one else. So I would just challenge you, Jehovah's Witnesses and everyone, to consider what you are referring to yourself as. Why not name yourself by the name of Christ and make Christ's name the most prominent? So that's all I have in this podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it. And just remember that if you have any questions or comments or even arguments that you'd like me to address on this podcast, feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is on my website at michaeljfelker.com. Just click on contact up at the top right, and you can just reach me there. And I read all the emails and all the comments, so definitely reach out to me if I can be of assistance in any way. As a matter of fact, I've been getting reached out to by a number of struggling Jehovah's Witnesses who are attending Kingdom Hall meetings, and they're benefiting from this podcast, but they're really struggling with some issues. So I am more than happy to help you in any way that I can. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you on the phone. So thanks again for listening and for watching. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.